Dear ladies and gentlemen, participants of the Symposium on Africa of the ICD, it's a great honor and pleasure to talk to you on behalf of the German Africa Foundation, which I am in charge of since 2016. Before that, I lived for 4 years in Kenya as the director of the German Chamber of Commerce, and I was as well in the Democratic Republic of Congo with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and the United Nations. And altogether, like our colleague has said, I lived for 10 years in sub-Saharan Africa. And having lived in Africa and being now in Germany, you see also quite a big disconnect between what you see are the priorities on the ground in Africa and how it's being perceived in German politics and in German policies towards Africa. And I don't want to focus also only on German politics, but also on European politics. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's been happening in Germany for the last 6 months. As you know, it's been the big Africa year in Germany. We've seen a number of initiatives from the German government, a number of initiatives from the G20 presidency that Germany has at the moment. More notably, I'll be talking about the so-called Marshall Plan with Africa by the Ministry of Development Cooperation and the Compact with Africa initiative, and what it actually means for Africa, and the question is if that's what is actually needed for development in Africa. How did it come to the sudden focus on Africa in German policy and the European policy and even in the G20 is of course linked to the migration debate. It's been something that I've wished for the many years I've been working in Africa, that there would be a stronger attention to African issues in the general political debate in Germany. It is, however, linked to the internal political debate that we have right now in Europe. And as you all follow the media, you know that there is a migration trend from sub-Saharan Africa countries which is currently taking place in Libya. So let's have a look at one of the first initiatives, which I'm sure you might have heard from in the media, which is called the so-called Marshall Plan with Africa by the German Ministry of Development Cooperation. Was an initiative by the Minister Dr. Gerd Müller, which was launched at the beginning of the year, which says we need, in fact, a shift away from the classical development cooperation, German development cooperation with Africa, which is focusing on classical issues like water, energy, health. And we need to shift more, we need to make a paradigm shift, as it was said, towards the private sector. You have to know that the budget of the Ministry of Development Cooperation in Germany is quite large. It's 8.5 billion euros. That's quite significant. It's the biggest budget that's ever been allocated to this ministry. So that's a bit of firepower. With 8.5 billion euros, you think you might be really having a possibility to influence things. Now you have to know that a quarter of this budget is being spent on multilateral organizations such as UNHCR, such as UNDP, such as UNEP, and the remaining 3/4 of it is being generally implemented by the Official Development Agency of Germany, the GIZ, which is the German Implementation Agency for Development Aid. So what is the Marshall Plan? It's a thin paper, which is, I think, 12 pages. And it's nothing more than a vague collection of ideas and strategies. It is focusing on 3 main issues: trade and investment, unemployment, peace, security, stability, and financing. And this is linked to the fact that there's a growing understanding that there needs to be a shift from the classical development cooperation, also due to the fact that scientific studies have shown that each dollar that is put in the investment with the private sector has an effect of 1 to 8 of money that is being spent through official development assistance. So right now we have a budget of 24 billion euros that is being spent worldwide through official development assistance in sub-Saharan Africa. Now here you have to also know another important figure which is often forgotten in this context, that the OECD estimates that there is an outflow of illicit financial funds from Africa around 60 billion euros. So, I mean, these figures are hard to put a finger down to, but it looks, at least according to the official figures of the OECD, that there is more than double the money that is being spent through official development assistance in sub-Saharan Africa is being taken out of the continent through illicit financial flows. Just to give you a bit of the background. So what else did we have? We had the Compact with Africa initiative of the G20 presidency of Germany. That was something that our finance minister Dr. Schäuble, initiated together with our Chancellor Angela Merkel. And it basically says that we need to change the regulatory and good governance framework in selected African countries that had to apply to be part of this Compact with Africa in order to foster the investment climate, in order to attract more international investment. So it is much less direct, but it's more looking really at the good governance framework in those countries. So we had the big Africa G20 conference in Berlin, headed by Angela Merkel, where we had, I think 25 African head of states. The president of the African Union, Alpha Conde, was here. And it all boils down to that 7 countries were picked to be part of that compact initiative. And these are Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Morocco, Senegal, and Tunisia. So, and I grappled a lot with the fact to understand what this is really all about, because what's the difference between the Compact with Africa and those other initiatives? And even those experts from the Ministry of Finance I talked to, and we organized a debate in Parliament about it, had difficulties to tell us exactly what is being planned, because there was at the time no money specifically foreseen, and those avenues that they were foreseeing are those of the Classical Development Corporation, which is mostly technical assistance given to the court system, given to the procurement system, and so on and so forth. So there's still the question, what is actually the new approach in this Compact with Africa initiative, as well with the Marshall Plan, and I'm going to come to this right now. So all of these initiatives basically say we need more private sector investment in Africa. We need to make sure that there's employment for Africa's growing youth. But if you look at the figures, right now, out of these 8.5 billion euros in the budget of the Ministry of Development Cooperation, 1.6% is being spent on the cooperation with the private sector. And that is also due to the fact that money cannot be shifted as easily as someone wishes in a classical development cooperation model, because you have to understand that according to the Paris Agenda, it is the development countries, the African countries itself, that say, that give the outline of which areas they want to focus their development assistance on. And those programs are normally negotiated through government negotiations for a period of 3 years. So it's not easy to say we want to shift away from classical development cooperation, shift to the private sector, but 80% of that money is in ongoing projects. So that is one challenge. But on the other hand, you wonder if only 1.6% out of these 8.5 billion euros is being spent on the cooperation with the private sector, what it all trickles down to. So what they have managed to do, they have managed to secure 300 million euros out of the existing budget, shifted it away from classical development cooperation projects to 3 of the 7 countries that were picked for the Compact with Africa. So this would be 100 million euros from German taxpayers' money for Ghana, 100 million for Cote d'Ivoire, and 100 million for Tunisia. None of these countries have a big significance in terms of the economic development of the entire continent. There are, apart from Tunisia, not even big regional players. And we have to also take into account that these are not the countries there where refugees or migrants from Africa are coming to Europe. Basically, the countries that are where those migrants are originating from in Germany is Eritrea, Nigeria, Somalia, and Guinea. So none of these compact countries are linked with those countries where the majority of the migration from is happening. So 300 million euros, and by the way, these 300 million euros are being portrayed in public as this is the money that we spend on the Marshall Plan, and by the same time, this is the money that we spend on the Compact with Africa. And it's not new money that is being added, but it's money that's been already in the budget of the Ministry of Development Cooperation. So you can already see that my evaluation of those initiatives is a bit sobering. those 300 million that are now for those new initiatives is a drop in the ocean compared to the 24 billion that is already spent through official development assistance. For me, it's more a cosmetic gesture. For me, it's more something that might create a political dynamic, also that the G20 has put it on top of their agenda. And that's a good thing, because you've got more and more African head of states and more African countries to really think, do we want to shift away from classical development cooperation, focus more on the private sector? But if it boils down to what Germany is doing and what Europe is doing, or even what the G20 is doing, on top of what they're already doing, it's negligible. So what would be needed? What could be done? Because it's easy to criticize and it's easy to put the finger to those figures and point out that it doesn't work that way. I think it's a good realization that Africa needs more private sector investment to develop. So how could that be achieved? We have something which are called the European Partnership Agreements with the African continent, which are done between the European Union as responsible entity for trade agreements and with the African regional organizations, such as the East African Community, such as ECOWAS, such as SADC. And those agreements have been negotiated for 10 years, in the case of the East African Community for 10 years, and they're not being led to a conclusion. What those agreements would mean that right now you can export from each and every African country for 0% taxes to Europe. So which is a good thing, I think we would all agree, because we would want to see more exports from Africa coming to Europe. So as we speak right now, none of the African countries pay any tariffs of the export of their products to Europe, to the European market. So what the EPA said, we would like to introduce reciprocity in this thing, because by virtue of international trade regimes, we need to have some sort of reciprocity. So what the EPA said, over the next 30 years, we should see a liberalized development of the trade regimes that also European producers can export to African countries for a lower percentage. That has caused a great political debate. People like Uganda's Museveni have talked about neo-colonialism, especially the Tanzanian president Magufuli has led the voice in the East African community to say this is exploitation and we want to dump our cheap products there. Now, having worked in East Africa for 4 years and having seen what enormous difficulties it is for a German and a European company to export to Africa, I would like to disagree with that. Because first of all, we have to understand, if you want investment, you need trade. There's no company in Europe, maybe in China, that will start by building up a factory in a country without having gone through the necessary stages of exporting, building up a local affiliate, making successful business with this country over a number of years, and then at the very last stage, people will say, okay, that's great, I trust this country, I trust this good governance framework, I want to put my money here, I start up a factory. And there's a number of German companies that have taken the step, especially in South Africa, where more than 1,000 companies, German companies, provide employment for 100,000 South African workers. And altogether, we have got about 1,500 German companies on the continent that create about 200,000 jobs. But like I said, none of these companies, and this is not a lot, 1,500 companies, foreign entire companies, have taken their investment before they could do trade and sell their products. And one important point in this context is that, to my experience and to my understanding, those products are not in competition with each other. We are not selling to Africa, and if you look at the trade statistics, it becomes very clear. We are not selling our potatoes, our bread, everything that could be produced on the African market. But we are exporting high-class machinery, we are exporting technical equipment that is not available on the African continent, which is currently taxed between 30 and 50%. So I think there's a compatibility, and I think the signing of the EPAs would in fact lead to much more investment in Africa. It would not be to the detriment to Africa. In my point of view, it's a highly politicized discussion. Even the representative of our Chancellor, Dr. Günther Noker, tends to disagree with that. But if you talk to the private sector, from people from Africa itself, they see it much less ideological, but very practical. So I think we need a signature of the EPAS. What else do we need? We need financing opportunities. We need financing opportunities for those small and medium African enterprises that want to start a business venture. Can you make a guess what is the normal credit rate if you want to apply for credit? If you say, I've got a good business idea and I want to open up a company. Can I just get a guess from you what you think is the normal credit rate? Let's say Kenya. How much would the bank charge you for credit? That's it. It starts between 18% in some countries, goes up to a staggering 35%. So you might have the best business idea, but if you go as an African to your local bank, how can you possibly pay back a loan with a 25% interest? Not possible. It's not something that you can do as a businessman. And we do have the German Development Bank. We've got the DEG who's providing those favorable credit rates, not the ones that we see in Europe these days, which are also incredibly low, but those ones that are, that you can realize a business idea with. However, they only apply between projects between 3 to 5 million euros, which is way too large, way too big for a small and medium African enterprise. So we've got the situation where you can get credit through the established microfinance mechanisms, which are very well established in lots of African countries, for small credits if you want to sell your peanuts on the market, and if you are a small, very micro enterprise, to get a credit up to $1,500 is not a problem. But the gap between $1,500, which will not take you very far, and the 3.5 million, 3 to 5 million which is needed to get through international financing mechanisms is huge. So you're basically leaving out the entire African middle class. So one thing to tackle the lack of of economic development would be really to target those SMEs that need financing, and that would be a major driver for development also for Africa's middle class. So I'm not talking about German companies here, I'm talking about African companies that can apply to DEG funding. One thing, which is more from the perspective of the German industry and the European industries, is public tenders. Do you know who's the biggest development bank in Africa? Who's providing most of the funding for development projects, energy, infrastructure in Africa? China is doing most of the investment, but not the Chinese Development Bank. Quite interesting. What would you guess? Which development bank? Is it the World Bank? World Bank. It's not the World Bank. It's the German KfW. KfW is bigger than the World Bank in Africa, and it's bigger than the African Development Bank in Africa. Right now they have projects of 6.5 billion euro in infrastructure and energy projects in Africa. So we're talking about almost the budget of the Ministry of Development Cooperation. We're talking about a large amount of money. Right now, a lot of these monies are going to Chinese companies. According to the OECD, it is those companies that provide the lowest tender for a bid that get the approval. And since the money is not given directly by the KfW to the companies, but it's being channeled through the host country, like, for example, if the KfW wants to implement a project in Kenya, it's the Kenyan government, the respective ministry, who's doing the tender and who's doing the evaluation. So we end up with the situation that the German taxpayer is funding basically Chinese infrastructure projects in Africa, which is something which is very difficult to comprehend, also given the fact how China is supporting their own companies and industries in Africa. And those of you who worked in Africa know what an aggressive expansion strategy China has in terms of infrastructure presence. And I don't want to be pointing the finger too much on China, but the big challenge that we see with big Chinese infrastructure projects is that there's virtually little knowledge transfer, and that a lot of the life cycle costs problems of big infrastructure infrastructure projects are not being taken into account. So what we would need is a stronger focus on quality, life cycle costs, and skills management in all those projects that are being tendered, and I think that would make a huge difference for the German private sector, but also for the African private sector, because our private sector has a different approach to partnership than some of the other partners. What would also be needed is a very strong and unequivocal shift to vocational training in Africa. And you know that Africa's youth unemployment is one of the biggest challenges, which is also linked to the current migration movement. We have figures between 25 up to 55% of Africa's youth being unemployed. The average age of a Kenyan is 19 years. The average age of a Malian is 15 years. The average age of a German is 46 years. So I'm still a little bit below the official average age in Germany. But you can see the challenge that comes with this demographic development, and if we don't focus, and if we don't put all our resources, I would even say, and even African countries as well, into providing employment for those young people, we will see big challenges not only in those African countries themselves, but also in Europe and Germany. So we as Germany have a very unique selling point, which is called dual vocational education. As you know, the youth unemployment in Germany is one of the lowest in the world. I don't know where we are right now, between 4 and 5%. And this is due to the fact that our apprenticeship system takes into consideration that in order to get employment with your vocational training, you need to do it on the job. There needs to be strong cooperation with the private sector and the public sector, which is providing the formal education. So in other words, a dual system. And I think that's something where especially German development aid should put their main focus on, to see what has worked here, what has worked elsewhere, and try to implement it in an African context, not one-to-one, because the differences are quite significant. But as we see right now, there's a lot of vocational training projects going on in Africa by putting schools on the green field, by not having any link to the real need in the private sector. So those people coming out of those vocational training institutions end up without employment. And finally, with such a large unemployment rate, you would think there's always enough people to do the jobs. But quite on the contrary, you need a highly trained workforce for industrial development. You need mechatronics, which is not even available as training in the African continent. You need technical engineers, but you also need, even for state-of-the-art infrastructure projects, state-of-the-art built plumbers, even scaffolders. So that's, in a nutshell, a very, very brief appreciation of how I see the situation right now, and I think we have to hurry up. Africa's population is growing by sub-Saharan Africa wide by 4%. When I came to Kenya in 2012, we had 42 million Kenyans. Right now in 2017, we have 47 million Kenyans. We expect a doubling of Africa's population by 2050. And if we don't tackle the underlying problems, which is, in my view, private sector development and youth unemployment, this is just the beginning of a massive challenge, not only in African countries, but also in Europe. We also have to start talking about demographics. And that's something which has been deleted from the agenda by the international development community. If you look at the funding for the United Nations agency, which is responsible for population or for demographics, I think it's UNFPA, their budget has been decreasing, and it's not even subject anymore in discussions, international discussions with Africans head of states. It's not on the agenda. And I don't think there's an easy solution to the demographic challenge, but at least we have to start talking about it. We have to be honest in our conversation with our African partners that it is a challenge. And I think it's also our responsibility that our development cooperation should in somehow reflect that challenge. And we need much more direct and effective steps than the Marshall Plan with Africa and the Compact with Africa if we want to realize those development goals in Africa. So I will conclude with this. I thank you very much for your attention. But I understand there's time for questions and answers, which I'm very happy to be available for.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. And we'll start the questions. Yeah, you're here Hello, I'm Francis Adams from Ghana. I have to be honest, I'm so happy, and it's very consoling to see that the pain that I've been going through for the past 7 years, you are also going through the same pain. But the nice thing is you are in the right position, and I really love your strength and persistence in this particular topic, because I tasted it and I couldn't stand it. And I went away, but my heart is still there. Now, it goes like this. I joined GIZ in Ghana. That was in 2006, after I graduated from school. I was working for the program for private sector economic development. In no time, I knew that I was in the right place, because in Africa, entrepreneurship is all about survival. We are not yet up to that level of making money for our big things, but basic level for the kitchen, just to be able to put food on the table, that is all entrepreneurship is about in Africa generally. And now when I look at it, how many people have training to run these businesses? So immediately in my first year with GIZ, I recommended to my country director and the head of my program that this is the area I want to specialize in. And I got SEFE trainings. Maybe you might have heard of SEFE trainings. It was developed by the GIZ, those days, German Technical Corporation and all, now privatized. Now, I got myself equipped. Within 2 years, I had trained more than 1,000 people in Ghana in our private sector economic development, mainly on creating industrial zones where you have place where you make power available for mechanics and all sort of people. Okay, the nice thing working for a German organization is that your boss is ready for your ideas. Unlike in Ghana, your boss tell you what to do. That's where you sit. But if you are working for a German outfit, you can challenge ideas. And I was so happy to do that. I'm not shy to ask a question if I don't know. The same way I wouldn't keep my thoughts with me. So, and my leaders like it. But then, who was going to support these ideas? Who was going to turn so much money coming? And it's just so painful to sit down there seeing the amount of resources that is coming and where this resource is channeled. And at the end, the whole thing is all about sustainability. And I said, if we have to be dealing with sustainability, then GIZ should rather follow heavily on the private sector economic development. So I tried and tried, it didn't work. I came out with a plan. I immediately called GIZ Sierra Leone. And I said, okay, I got myself trained in this. And I want to promote this all over Africa. And I want to start from Sierra Leone and also Rwanda. I had already made connections with Rwanda. Then the team leader in Sierra Leone, I had internship with her while I was still studying, so she knew me well. So we organized, and I took my leave time all the way to Sierra Leone. So my duty was, okay, what happened in Sierra Leone that time was that after the war, more than about half of the youth population in that country could not read or write. And you ask yourself, what then do you do with this kind of population? But with the techniques I used in business training was that even if someone couldn't read or write, you can still train the person to manage their businesses very well. So I ran over there. For 1 month period, we had trained about 600 people. And then I had to advise GIZ Sierra Leone on these employment creation things, which I have to be honest, they took serious. And within 1 year, they had trained 2,500 people within Sierra Leone and Liberia. That was a research later on done by GOPA. There's this consulting company. I have the report. If you want later, I can forward it to you. So I returned back to Ghana, and what happened? They made me national advisor of this micro-entrepreneurship development. You ask yourself, who am I going to advise? Unfortunately, actually this is really painful. My boss was a Ghanaian, and whatever I said to him came back to me. It never got to the GIZ expert up there. And at the end, what happened? I'm a young person. I want my dreams to come true. Do you think I will sit down and feel like I'm working for an organization? No, I don't want them to pay me for nothing. I left. And even my sponsorship that GIZ had promised me to further my studies, they denied me the sponsorship. I had to find my own way sponsoring my education in Germany. So, you see, when he started, he explained it, I kind of like expected that. Having this wide range of experiences within Africa and coming back home, my question is always, if people really observe it right, they either leave or they stay and then fight and fight and fight till they get something changing. Other than that, part of development cooperation is more on the cosmetic side. But if you really want to change things for Africans, seriously, training into micro enterprise development, this is the way to get people set for everything. So,
okay.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. I think let's take maybe two or three questions, and then I do one reply session.
Good morning. I work for a regional DFI on our continent, and one of the requirements that was made, for instance, in South Africa, was for any loan, you would have like the employment equity, which would, I believe, build our middle class. But what does the Compact Initiative, what percentage, or does it have any percentage that goes towards skills transfer of locals, or skills or participation of local businesses? Yeah, I'm not sure if you're able to answer that, but it's of interest to me.
Yeah. Take one more question, and then I think I'll just.
Do we have another question? Okay, the last one.
That's pretty similar to what Francis said before. I wonder, what about local people? So yes, about education training, and well, because of this, we always say the change must be bottom up and not top down, and it looks like another one project that comes from the top in order to invite people to, I don't want to say obey, but something like this, in order to change their mind from the top. And it's not something, I want to know what local people think about these deals, about this agreement. And that's pretty funny because, Germany is one of the most arms provider in Africa. So it's a funny contradiction, From one side, you say Germany that gives money to development, and on the other side, they sell money. I don't know. I want to know how do you deal with this?
What do you mean they sell money?
Well, gives money in order to develop new projects, philanthropy, and so on. On the other side, they gain from this, from war conflict zones. So how do you deal with this? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Let me start with my colleague from Ghana. Yeah, it's good to have that sort of confirmed by somebody who's an African, who's been on the ground, and who's been also having the tough struggle. And I congratulate you for what you tried to do in Ghana. And I know how hard it is, because I tried to do the same thing in Kenya. And how difficult it is actually to get money, and you see how much money is being spent on classical development cooperation projects. Enormous amounts of money. Alone the bilateral business budget with Kenya is 42 million for 3 years. That's a lot of money. Not 2% is being spent on vocational training. So, but what can we do about it? And I think I would like to also raise the point that we have now a window of opportunity, because if you look at the Marshall Plan, if you look at the Compact with Africa, everybody talks about youth employment in Africa. Everybody seems to finally have understood that vocational training might be a solution to the underlying problems. I think what we have to do right now is to see if the new members in Parliament, if the new budget committees are coming into session at the beginning of next year, that those people have to be bombarded with news, with figures, with facts, to make them understand that it's not enough to do a cosmetic gesture of 300 million. And by the way, out of this 300 million, to my knowledge, nothing is being spent on skills development. What I know for sure is that 100 million euros in Ghana are being spent on renewable energy, which have a skills development component. But what we need is a real focus on this. So there again, there's this big disparity between the Sunday speeches, as I call it, and what's being done in reality. Now, looking into South Africa, you already have touched a very, very complex situation with the Employment Equity Act in Africa and the whole question of affirmative action. And the question for South Africa, I think, is the balance to find the right balance between whatever needs to be done, and nobody doubts that something needs to be done in terms of affirmative action and employment equity, but not destroying the underlying principles of the private sector economy, which is basically that the enterprise needs a certain amount of freedom to decide who is going to be allocated to which tasks, and have the government not interfere it in a way that makes their business impossible. I'm not going to touch more upon it because it's such a controversial debate, but as you know, the South African economy is struggling enormously with it, and I think there might be lessons to learn. If I see in other countries there's the debate about employment quotas, and from a private sector perspective, I would be very careful. Now, bottom-up approach. Yeah, it's good. It's good to have these discussions like these, and it's good. And I've had a lot of discussions in Kenya and workshops about it, and it's always good. But somehow we need to make sure that those good discussions and points are not staying at this level, but are being fed into the political decision-making process. I'm trying to do that with a very modest approach by organizing debate for members of parliament. And I have to be honest, you are sometimes shocked how little these people know how it works and how this money is being spent. They live in a lot of cliches, they live in a lot of world of general statements, but to have a member of parliament really willing to trickle down and ask also the ministry, why can it be that only 1% of the money is being spent on skills development, whereas we make big public Sunday speeches, even by our chancellor, and that's not being reflected in the day-to-day budget of those implementation agencies. And I think I encourage you to do your part, I'll do my part, but I think that message has to pass, and we need a lot to work on the capacity of those political decision makers, because you said a lot of people on the ground know what the problem is. So that's the one thing with bottom up. Now, what is Germany gaining from doing business with Africa? Not a lot. I mean, yes, it's definitely between all the continents in the world. I think it's 0.8% of all German international trade is being done with the entire African continent, less than 1%. That's next to nothing. That's next to nothing, given the fact that we're talking about a continent that will have 1 billion people in 2050. So I think there's room for development, and as somebody who's been working with the private sector a lot, I would say it's a legitimate thing to do profit with a country. This is the whole reason for private sector to exist, and it's legitimate, and we shouldn't keep those people that are doing business with Africa even a stronger burden by putting too much expectations on them. German companies, European companies, companies in general are not there to fight poverty. It's not their job. They fight poverty by doing what they do, which is being a private sector, providing employment. But I don't think you have a successful business model in the long term if you go down to any African country or development country and say, I want to create employment for the sake of providing. You need a sound business idea. You need to sell your product, even if your product is a good idea, and to monetize it in order to fight poverty. So that in a nutshell. Thanks a lot for your attention.